Apologies for that disruption. George III, king at the beginning of the Regency period in England, has a problem other than the fact that his subjects across the Atlantic Ocean in the 13 colonies are in revolt. His problem is that he suffers terribly with mental illness. According to historians, he has frequently, at least as frequent, that's relative, but he has breaks with reality. And as a result, ultimately in 1810, he's deemed unfit to rule. Like, he just can't carry on being king, at which point a regent, like a substitute or acting monarch, was appointed by Parliament to rule on his behalf. And in this case, Parliament appointed kind of the obvious choice, which would be King George III's eldest son, George IV. So from that point on, for roughly 10 years, the official head of England's government was the Prince Regent, so acting in the office of king until his father dies and he, assumes the crown properly, George IV. Altogether, George IV rules first as Prince Regent and later as king outright from 1810 until 1830. It's a solid 20 years. George is succeeded by his brother William, who reigns until 1837, and culturally speaking, we kind of tend to think of William's reign as an extension of George's. Life and culture in England are pretty similar through that transition. The big change comes when the next monarch, Queen Victoria, the Queen Victoria, ascends the throne. She reigns for 100 years or something crazy, and her time period gets its own name, i.e. the Victorian period, but we're not there yet. So, legally, there was only an actual regency going on in England for about 10 years, but culturally, the period we refer to as the Regency era, defined by the norms and manners of the two Georgian reigns, Georges III and IV, that's much longer. Altogether, when we talk about the Regency period, we're talking about everything from the tail end of the 18th century through more or less the second. We're talking about everything from the tail end of the 18th century through more or less the first half of the 19th century. So 1795 to 1837. Some cultural hallmarks of the Regency period to kind of help get you a picture of this time that we're entering through literature for this week. The Prince Regent himself is almost the antithesis of what we think about when we think about Regency culture. He is so not the picture of Regency behavior. He is the picture of Regency fashion. Because the Regency period is a period of almost worshipful attendance on the example set by the nobility and by royalty, fashion during this period really strongly conforms itself to the choices made by the Prince Regent and his court. Behaviorally, however, very different story. The Prince Regent was a notorious personality. This was a man who ate way too much, drank way too much, partied like it was 1799, slept around, he had many mistresses, and he spent money. Money everywhere. He racked up a huge amount of debt that Parliament basically had to slowly bail him out of after over a period of several years. His coronation, when he went from Prince Regent to King, George IV's coronation cost something like 20 times more than what his father's coronation had cost. He was a fabulous sort of a figure, at least for a little while until it caught up with him, and then he was decidedly less fabulous. By the time he actually ascended the throne as king, he was very overweight, which was something not at all as common at the time as it is now. And some scholars believe he may also have been addicted to opiates. Laudanum would have been the form at the time. So, as I said, this is not at all the picture of manners and priorities that we think of when we think of the Regency era, which most people recognize through the works of Jane Austen. She's our girl. She is the most definitive and lasting window into what the world was like, particularly for middle and upper class families during this period. And middle and upper class families are the only ones anybody really cared about during the Regency, so I suppose that's fitting. Normally, when we think about the Regency, we think about an exacting, almost devout attention to precise manners, matters of decorum and etiquette, social rules, and especially to class divisions. Social hierarchy is sacrosanct during this period for the majority of respectable people. Behaving in accordance to your station, that's the order of the day. Partly, this was a social reaction amongst bourgeois people to, I wanted to say horrors, and then I hesitated to try and decide whether that word was appropriate. But this was a reaction amongst bourgeois people to the really violent, dramatic news that had been coming out from the French Revolution. If you know anything about the French Revolution, you know that it was exactly a kind of like, bring down the monarchy, bring down the oppressive rich who are like eating the hearts out of the poor. It was really kind of a modest proposal minded type revolution. People stormed civic buildings like the Bastille in Paris, and it was enormously bloody. People who were deemed to be part of the bourgeois, the oppressive ruling class, were guillotined. They were executed in the streets by mobs in this like reign of terror that followed the initial revolution. It was ugly, messy stuff. And there were a lot of people from France who kind of fled to England during that time, and it was in the news. And so there was this big hum about the sort of the excesses of the French Revolution that really took root and had an equal and opposite reaction, right? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. They had an effect of this kind in England. Basically, because of the French Revolution and later, or sort of slightly thereafter, the American Revolution, political ideologies of reform and social justice that had led into those sort of bloody rebellions against monarchs and against the nobility, really any landed wealthy people of rank and title, anybody considered to be part of the system, by those who wanted to abolish the system. In the words of Regency historian Regina Jeffers, these stories of horror from the bloody French Revolution turned many Englishmen against the idea of reform at all. Just like, no, they sort of associated reform type attitudes or reform initiatives with rebellion and bloodshed and all of this. So again, in Regina Jeffers' words, any steps toward thinking of changing the status of the working poor through governmental reform took on the language of treason. And the idea of change in the electoral system took a gigantic step backward. Her word, gigantic step backward. So the Regency era thus became characterized for many by a rigorous allegiance to the status quo and to the dictates of nobility culture. One of the biggest items of political writing to come out of the Regency era, political nonfiction, right, like a treatise, was Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. And there are some key quotes from this piece that can really kind of show us how the revolutions and other political upheavals surrounding England at this time, like the Napoleonic Wars, contributed in conservative circles, and especially bourgeois circles or middle upper class circles, to this highly protectionist, hierarchical, traditional family values kind of attitude that really strove to shore up the pillars of the status quo and to instill people, regular, ordinary British subjects, to instill them with a sense that being dutiful and deferent and loyal and group-minded and obedient to one's place in the world was noble. It was, in fact, virtuous and even beautiful. There's a lot of that idea that's quite clearly readable here in this piece by Burke. So I'm going to give you a few quotes. And this, again, is going to be one of those places where some of my biases come through in the way that I read these quotes, because there are certain elements of these quotes that I, think are quite sane and sort of lovely, but then there are others that I just think are so toxic, and I'm sure that will come through, but those are my views, and you as thinking, feeling adults will, of course, form your own. So these are some of the quotes that I pulled from Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolutions in France. Revolution, singular, in France. First quote, "Kings will be tyrants by policy when subjects are rebels from principle." That's quite a line. When subjects are rebels from principles, fundamental values that form the social contract, well, that's when the government has to come down hard and shore up how things ought to be. Kings will be tyrants by policy when subjects are rebels from principle. So, don't be rebels, and your government will be sensible and sane and gentle. Another quote. This is Edmund Burke reflecting on a recent trip to France where he actually visited the French court and he met the king and queen. It would have been Queen Marie Antoinette, who is such a famous figure of the French Revolution. And he's describing his admiration for her here at the beginning. "I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone." Guys, this is like possibly the first public sort of conservative iteration of somebody saying chivalry is dead. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, think armchair philosophers, people who love to talk smart from the comfort of their own homes. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded. And the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Never, never more shall we behold that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of heart which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of an exalted freedom. It is gone. That sensibility of principle, that chastity of honor which felt a stain like a wound, which inspired courage whilst it mitigated ferocity, which ennobled whatever it touched. This is kind of a classic rhetorical moment where Edmund Burke is saying, these things have gone from European society. These things are no more. And of course, the people who sympathize with these values, especially in reaction against the revolutions, are going to go, no, they're not, and do their best to shore up these values. Basically, by saying these things are dead and making them beautiful and sympathetic as beautiful dead things are, Edmund Burke is sort of subtly trying to give them a boost in the social mindset. Third quote. "Society is indeed a contract. But the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, or calico, or tobacco, or some other such low concern, to be taken up for little temporary interest and dissolved by the fancy of the parties. No, it is to be looked on with other reverence. Reverence. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends or goals of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, and by this Burke means the goals of such a social contract can't be held stable except by their continuation over many generations. Thus, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, between contemporaries, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Each contract of each particular state or country is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and invisible world according to a fixed compact, sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and moral natures, each in their appointed place. The social contract, Burke is saying, is a reflection of the divine contract between God and rulers and human beings, the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower and the higher natures, connecting the visible and the invisible world, according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath, or the sacred promise, which holds all physical and moral natures, each in their appointed place. Your station in life is appointed by a sacred compact, a metaphysical sacred compact. This is important stuff. This is highly influential thinking and rhetoric during the Regency period. That about wraps up. Oh, no, wait, no, I did want to mention one other thing. Just so while we're talking about Regency culture, there is this amazing, awesome, wonderful YouTube video by a YouTuber who works under the name of Ellie Dashwood. Her video is called Culture of the Regency Era. It's excellent and comprehensive, but specific in just the right ways. I highly recommend it. I will link it in the comments to this video. For almost all other delightful and frivolous or particular concerns that you might have regarding sort of all things Regency or Jane Austen, Ellie Dashwood, she's got you covered. This woman has an extensive backlog of really quality videos. She knows her stuff. So with that about wraps our introduction to the Regency period. I'm not going to do any dedicated introduction to Jane Austen herself, the person, since there is a wealth of readily accessible, stable information out there that you can look up if you want to. The one thing I will say about Jane Austen, for those of you who have chosen to read her novel for this unit, Northanger Abbey, is that, in my opinion, this is totally me, this is all Beth, in my opinion, Jane Austen novels are some of the only books in the world that come across better when adapted to film. For me, Jane Austen stories are some of the only stories about which I tend to hear myself saying, I like the movie better than the book. And here's why. When we read plays, we're kind of missing the drama. We're missing the action, the delivery, the gestures that give meaning to the text. I think for today's readers of Jane Austen, there's a risk that same thing can happen. Jane Austen readers that were living during Jane Austen's time would have been able to see vividly everything that she was trying to represent in her text because they were familiar with it. It was all around them. Whereas for us, the intricacies of parlor culture in Jane Austen's time are distant enough that they're hard to picture, to understand. When there's a scene written out that, I don't know, somebody had a glove off when they should have had a glove on, and it's it's a big thing, right? Sometimes we can't understand why, but if you see it happen, you see people behaving and reacting to one another, you go, oh no, I get it. Manners, hierarchy, etiquette, they are so much more visible on stage and screen, and it's easier to understand the implications of the social drama unfolding before your eyes than it is to visualize and comprehend off the page. So I always recommend a good film adaptation. There is a really strong recent film adaptation of Northanger Abbey that, again, I will detail in the comments on this video. Again, concerning this specific novel that I've chosen for this unit from Jane Austen, just a couple of brief things to say. Northanger Abbey is not really the very best introduction that you could have to Jane Austen as a writer. It's actually one of her lesser known novels. It's kind of one of her B-sides. But I felt that it would be appropriate in this unit because it's kind of a deliberate satire on some of the foibles or pitfalls of certain trends from Romanticism. Most particularly, it's kind of a send-up of the pulp Gothic Romanticism that was popular in almost like what you would now call drugstore fiction or corner store fiction at the time. You know, paperbacks, page turners that you can kind of pick up anywhere. They're cheap. There are tons of them, and they're very popular. You know, they might be bestsellers, but they probably aren't winning any awards for high distinction. Pulp Gothic Romanticism, which I'll talk a little bit about in our Romanticism video, super popular during this period, even amongst, you know, ladies of distinction. They might have a sneaky pulp novel under their pillow at night. And this book is Jane Austen really kind of digging into that. So I thought it was a natural fit. Second point, if you really enjoy Jane Austen already, or if you read this book and you think, oh man, I'd like to see what she's like at her best, at the height of her powers, easy. I can very clearly send you to either one of two books. You want Sense and Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice. Fabulous tour de force works. I'll leave it at that. Those would be my sort of further recommendations for a real dig into Jane Austen. There you have it, my pretties, your introduction to the Regency era, and ever so briefly to Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. Go in peace to savor Ms. Austen's razor-sharp wit and her great good sense. I wish you a very pleasant, restful Easter vacation. I will see you in term 2.